want to express themselves authentically and with clarity, and they want to be able to do work that they can feel proud of. And so ChatGPT can help with that. If we start with that broader look, we might see more opportunity than just sort of that smaller cheating element of the whole thing. AI can't do everything for you. Okay, but we also live in a world where I don't think it's reasonable to say AI can't do anything for you. So we have to find together the middle ground where we can be confident that learning is still happening.
Hey, you found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something. Hi, and welcome back to Ways We Learn. I'm Sean. Joe and Brian are off today. And I know today's guest from way back in a previous life when I was at Riverdale Country School and he was at Global Online Academy. And our organizations were working on a learner dashboard that was meant to show learning at a very granular level. And so if you're an education geek like me, you know that he was really serious about meaningful and measurable learning. And so when I saw that he wrote a recent series on AI in education, I just had to check it out because I've been thinking about the same thing. So I want to share a passage from that to get us started here. He wrote, "For me, there are two essential elements to supporting educators in adapting to innovations in education: purpose and practice. We need to be clear about why an innovation is relevant to their work and to their students, and then we need to introduce some basic strategies that give them enough confidence to explore on their own." And he goes on, "How we frame AI for ourselves as educators will affect how we frame it for our students. And I believe strongly that how we talk to students about AI will have a lasting impact on how they see its role in their own lives." And so today, we get to speak with my friend Eric Hudson about just that. How do we frame AI for educators and students, and how do we shape its role in their lives? So Eric, thank you so much for joining us on Ways We Learn.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's start off with your background. Just tell us what you've been doing in education and what got you to this place.
Yeah, sure. I've been in education really my entire career. I started as a classroom teacher, and I was in the classroom for about 12 years, maybe a little more. I taught English, Spanish, and journalism over the years to middle school, high school, and college students. And it still remains the most interesting work and most exciting work I've ever done. I loved being in the room with kids. And then about 10 years ago, I transitioned into Global Online Academy, or GOA. And that is a nonprofit organization that does passion-based online courses for high school students, as well as professional learning for teachers and school leaders. And I spent a decade there. I was an instructional coach to begin with, played a lot of different roles, ultimately left this past summer as chief program officer. And it was just an incubator of innovation in education, I guess I would say. A lot of thinking in different ways about teaching and learning and trying to really exploit the potential of the online learning space. And it really opened my eyes to sort of the different ways in which we can learn, which is probably a lot of what we're going to talk about in this conversation. Yeah. And then I left after 10 years this past summer. I'm on my own as a consultant and just kind of exploring new ideas and different pathways right now.
All right, very nice. And so before we get started talking about AI in education, I think we probably want to define some terms. When we talk about things like AI, that's a very broad topic that's been around for many years, but that's not specifically what most people are talking about when they talk about AI right now. So can you just give some background that's going to help people understand this conversation about what the things are that you're actually talking about?
Sure. I think when we talk about AI in education, or when you hear people use the term AI right now, they're talking mostly about generative artificial intelligence. So those are things like ChatGPT or Bing or Claude. These are tools, large language models that use data scraped from the internet and other resources to create material based on prompts that we give them. It's sort of this prediction-based model. So it's creating new content out of the data that it's pulled from various places. But you're right. I mean, that's only one kind of AI. Artificial intelligence has been around for a really long time, actually. Machine learning has been around for a long time. In self-driving cars. I was in San Francisco a couple of months ago, and you can't cross the street without seeing a driverless car. I read an article about AI spotting tumors in folks' brains while they're on the operating table. So it's everywhere. But I think when we talk about AI in education right now, we are talking about that generative artificial intelligence sort of segment of the field.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And so then as you've come through your work in education and sort of come to the place that you are now, how did you get started thinking about AI and how it fits into education? Because everybody's thinking about this right now. What was your path to thinking about this, and why is this something that you're interested in?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've always been really interested in technology as a way to enhance teaching and learning. I started blogging with my students in 2005, so I think I've always had that sort of innate affinity for it. And technology has, throughout my career, made me a better teacher. And that's always the approach I've taken to it. I think specifically with artificial intelligence, when ChatGPT came out in the fall of 2022, I was still at GOA, and we were working a lot with teachers and students around how do we think about technology as an empowering tool, as a tool that students can use to drive their own learning, to pursue their own interests, to bring in more voice and choice. And AI just seemed very clearly an extension of that to me. And so I really wanted to learn about it from that lens. And then within a very short period of time, it became clear that this is what everybody was going to be talking about. And so as I think we'll talk about and as I write about, I just tried to use it more to make sense of it, figure out what it could and could not do, and then think through that lens of what are the potential applications for teachers. And that's always been sort of what sparks my interest when it comes to education.
I'm curious, working at GOA, because they were very forward thinking about education and how to, just going back to what we were working on with GOA at Riverdale, thinking about how to represent learning in a better way than a transcript. That's really progressive thinking. And I'm curious, was what you just described as your feeling about AI as you started to see ChatGPT and then eventually the others that followed, as those things were coming out and you were seeing these as a way to extend student ability in the classroom, were others at GOA sharing that view, or was that more debated within that organization?
No, I think it's a pretty progressive bunch, and I think a very open-minded bunch. I think what's important to know about GOA's model, which has been true since it started in 2011, is that our classes are small, 20 to 30 students, and we hire teachers from the bricks and mortar classroom. We hire in-person educators, and we train them in teaching online in relationship-based, student-centered ways. And so our approach has always been pedagogy first, excellent teaching first, and then we'll teach you the tools and modalities to translate that into different learning environments. And so when AI came out, it felt very much just like an extension of that work. Here is another tool. It's a technology tool that, at least for now, we have an enormous amount of agency over, and we can really use it to make our work better. And so I think the GOA team very much started playing around with it as a tool that could enhance the quality of the learning that was happening in our classes.
That's great. So, all right, so then let's move outside of GOA, because not everybody is thinking that progressively about AI. Yeah. What are you hearing about the topic of generative AI from educators? Because anybody who is following this stuff might be aware that there are some educators and some even school districts that have not embraced generative AI. And one of the big ones that I'm thinking of is New York City public schools, which as soon as ChatGPT came out, banned it. And I believe I wrote at the time on LinkedIn what a problem this was. And thankfully, they went and reversed it this year. I don't think it was because of me, but I like to take credit. But what are you hearing from people about this? How are people thinking about this? Are you hearing responses to your posts on it, just from talking with people? What is the general feeling now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would emphasize that it's a really wide range of emotions and reactions. And that's true for teachers, that's true for administrators, and that's true for students. So I would say at one end of the spectrum, the reaction is very justifiable worry about what does this mean for productive struggle in learning? What does this mean for us being able to trust each other and students around the work that's being turned in? Is this the end of certain academic disciplines and certain academic pursuits? All the way to the other side of, this is an incredibly powerful tool that can transform what I'm capable of doing in the classroom. If whether or not I'm a student or a teacher, my students can do lots of different things, and I can do a lot better work, maybe in a more efficient way using these tools. And it's everything in between. I think the topic that I'm hearing, the two topics I'm hearing the most about are academic integrity and assessment. So what does it mean to do academically honest work in the age of AI? And what is the potential impact on the design and facilitation of assessments in the age of AI?
Yeah, and let's definitely talk about those two things. Before, though, you mentioned productive struggle, and I want to just come back and define that for anybody who isn't familiar with that term in education. Can you just sort of contextualize that and why we would think about that with AI?
Yeah, sure. So productive struggle has a lot of different terms, but basically it's a key ingredient for learning. So the premise is students need to feel a sense of struggle in order to learn. Not too much, right? And not too little. And that goes to concepts like zone of proximal development, which is this idea that if students have the right kind of support, they can do tasks that are challenging for them and they will learn. But if we give them tasks that they can't do with support, then they get frustrated or they get anxious and they aren't able to learn the task. If you've read the book Flow, it's a very similar concept. And so the idea of productive struggle is, we know that students need to do things that are hard in order to learn, but they shouldn't be too hard. They should be challenging in a productive way. And that is really the sweet spot that teachers are aiming for when they're doing instruction or when they're designing assessments or when they're working with students in the classroom.
Okay, great. Yeah. So, all right. So let's link that then to the concept of AI, right? Because I think that's at the root of a lot of people's fears about it. Cheating is sort of one end of that, where you would say, okay, so it's not the student's work, but part of the reason that you need it to be the student's work is in order for them to actually learn from the experience. And so if the student is saying, Professor Hudson gave me this prompt that I need to write about, I'm going to take that, copy and paste it into ChatGPT and get a working paper that I can then submit for my grade, then the student hasn't worked with the information. So that's sort of one end of the spectrum of fears, right? The cheating, academic integrity. And so how do you, I guess, how do you help people? You can't say it's not going to happen, right? You can't say to someone, no student in your classroom is ever going to use this for cheating, and so therefore it's fine. How do you help people understand that there are benefits, that they would give it enough weight that this is worth doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for giving me a pay raise and calling me professor. I appreciate that. It's a really gray area right now. And it's a really gray area because these tools, these AI tools, are evolving really quickly, and what they can do is really changing. And so for me, with any innovation in education, you think about the calculator, you think about Google Translate, you think about the internet. You've got to be super clear about what you're trying to assess in the first place, right? So what is the thing we want students to demonstrate to us? What is the sort of skill? You can think of Bloom's taxonomy as an example of, like, do we want students to evaluate? Do you want them to create? Do you want them to analyze? If you're super clear about what you're trying to assess, then you can probably also identify the things that are not that important in the process. So how might a student use AI to get closer to that sweet spot and then dedicate themselves to learning based on the thing you want to assess? So the example that I give often is, obviously we don't want AI to write an essay for a student in English class, right? As you said, but if the goal is students demonstrate that they can craft a solid argument, what's the sort of argument against allowing them to use AI to help them figure out how to improve their quote integration, right? So not about choosing the quote, but about smoothing the integration of the quote into the text, for example. If we're teaching a drama class and we want to assess students on their acting ability and their scene construction, is it a problem if they get AI to write the dialogue for them? These are the questions that I don't have maybe Professor Hudson has the answer to all those questions, but I don't have the answer to these questions.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I really advocate for just a lot of open conversation among teachers and with students around, what does it mean to do this work with the help of AI? Where are those boundaries? How do we co-construct some norms and guidelines around those things? Of course, there are non-negotiables. I think you articulated one really well. AI can't do everything for you. Okay, but we also live in a world where I don't think it's reasonable to say AI can't do anything for you. Mm-hmm. So we have to find together the middle ground where we can be confident that learning is still happening.
Yeah, and I want to break down what you were saying, because what you're getting at is, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but I think what you're getting at is the notion of directed practice, right? So instead of saying, every time my students write a paper, I want them to go through all of the motions of writing a paper in full. What you're saying with that example is, this time when you write a paper, I want you to focus on constructing a thesis, right? And you're going to go through the rest of the motions of writing a paper, but the thesis is the thing that I'm assessing right now. And so it doesn't actually matter that much how the rest of the paper gets created if we're only focusing on that part of the assessment. And I know somebody is going to be furious with me for saying it doesn't matter how the rest of that paper is created, but hopefully they'll understand the point here, which is that you're focusing them on the individual portions of the things they need to learn. And you mentioned Bloom's taxonomy, so breaking it down and saying we're not actually focused on creation, or no, I guess in this example, we are focused on creation, right? So we're focusing on creating that thesis statement. We're not so much focused on analysis, which would be then the further writing of the paper. And so if you wanted to take the thesis and then feed that into ChatGPT, for example, and say, give me a finished paper with this thesis, how would this work? That might be a way to use ChatGPT hand in hand with the student actually doing that small subset of writing a paper, as opposed to write a paper each time in full, go through everything.
Totally. And I think what you said, the phrase do this hand in hand with students, is the most important element. I was in Atlanta doing some presenting, and I heard a story about a teacher who she began the essay writing process with her students by asking them to feed the prompt for the essay into ChatGPT as the first step. Get ChatGPT to write the essay for them, and then they evaluated the output as a class. Nice. And made decisions about whether or not it was good, what was not good, and then could the students go home and do better, right? What could they do to make it better? Yeah. What could they generate that's better? Yeah, and then they would, throughout the process, keep feeding stuff into ChatGPT, get ChatGPT to give them some feedback, get ChatGPT to try to do better than what they had produced. And I think that's a really good example of that middle ground that I was talking about earlier, of it's not really about this binary of we can use this assessment or we have to throw this assessment away. Yeah. It's what impact does ChatGPT or generative AI have on the process by which we do this work?
Yeah, and also when I was teaching teachers Bloom's taxonomy, and of course the updated version of it, which goes into metacognition and different ways of thinking and different ways of knowing. And metacognition is real hard. And what you just hit on is that, right? That is a metacognitive exercise. You're thinking about the thinking of the machine. You're thinking about your own thinking. How would I improve it? That's real hard in a classroom. And that feels like it's a great exercise for people to use. But I love that you're sort of focusing on using the assist, but then splitting out the assessment of those individual components of what someone's trying to do.
Yeah, and I think I would want to call out an assumption we might be making in this conversation, which is that students want to use ChatGPT to cheat, that they want ChatGPT to do this work for them. Students often see the output and they're like, this is not that great, or this doesn't reflect what I believe, or this is not written
or what
in
I'm
my
capable
voice.
Of. Yeah.
Right. And so students want to express themselves authentically and with clarity, and they want to be able to do work that they can feel proud of. And so ChatGPT can help with that. And so what I like about the example of that teacher I heard was the goal is still to get students to generate their own work. It's just the prompt is no longer, you have to sit there by yourself in sort of a vacuum and come up with it. It's that there's this tool out there that can actually maybe give you a little spark or give you something, a little positive friction in your thinking process to maybe produce better work.
Yeah, and I hope people who are listening to this are taking away the sort of hopeful tone that I'm hearing, which is that, okay, yes, it can be used for cheating. Yes, nobody here is denying that. But honestly, students, some students might want to cheat with it, but really students, on the whole, want to do good work. And the reason, I've said this to other people, the reason that a lot of times students want to cheat is because they don't like to do stupid assignments. And so if you're handing them a stupid assignment and saying, go and spend all of your time doing this, okay, yeah, they might find ways to cheat, but hopefully we're not giving stupid assignments, and therefore they're not going to be interested in just plugging it into a computer.
Yeah, I mean, students have been cheating for centuries.
There are other ways.
They will continue to cheat, right? And I think there's research on cheating that articulates lots of different reasons why students cheat. Lack of interest in the assignment, or pressed for time, or stress, or contextual issues, right? And we could do a lot in schools and in society, frankly, to address those root causes. But banning some of these technologies, it's treating the symptom, not the disease, right?
100%.
And so I think thinking of it, I heard in January an English teacher interviewed on a podcast, and she said this thing that has really become a mantra when I work with schools, which is, her colleagues, she's an English department chair at a high school in Oregon, and her colleagues were saying, kids are going to use this to cheat. And she was like, you have to stop thinking about it as cheating and start thinking about it as assistance. Cheating is certainly an element of too much assistance, right? It lives within that bubble of assistance, but there's so many other ways that students can use AI as an assistant that can be very empowering and still be academically honest. And if we start with that broader look, we might see more opportunity than just sort of that smaller cheating element of the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think I want to take it back to assessment too, because I think that a lot of this comes back to what are we actually trying to measure? So if we're trying to measure a student's ability to perform on a given task, okay, let's break that down. Say maybe it's a final paper, and we actually do need to see what a student can produce on a final paper. Fine, that's fair. You don't want them to write with ChatGPT if that's what you're trying to measure. But if what you're trying to measure is some subset of that thing, or even if it's, I would want to measure how does a student use ChatGPT, like how intelligently can they leverage the assistance of this thing in order to come up with a great product. And it sort of forces us in education to reevaluate the goals that we have for our students, and potentially to fit new goals in as these new technologies come out that, listen, they're going to be with us for the rest of our lives. AI is not going away. It's only going to get smarter. It's only going to get better. It's only going to get easier to cheat with or use for the assist on a more optimistic view. And okay, we better be teaching our kids how to use it, and also our teachers. And so I hope there's some faculty listening to this who are taking that away, that this really does need to be part of the educational system. And it's not just that we're throwing our hands up and going, okay, whatever, we can't get away from it. There are real valuable uses of it, and it outweighs the risks, is how I see that, at least.
Yeah, and it's all, so much of teaching is modeling, right? And so I think like that passage you quoted at the very beginning of the way we talk to students about AI, however much we do or do not use it in class, the way we frame it for them really matters. And so if we take a sort of affirmative stance, if we take a learning stance towards it and explore it with them, I really believe that they are more likely to do that with the tool for the rest of their lives, as opposed to if we ban it or poo-poo it or don't allow them to use it, whatever. I think it just, as an educator, I would want to model the learning stance for students around something like this.
Yeah, of course. What other examples have you seen that are really positive uses of this technology, of generative AI, not just ChatGPT?
In terms of classroom use, like sort of working with teachers and students?
Yeah, for learning experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing it as an accelerator for inquiry-based learning. So, for example, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, right? There's 17 goals. Those are a very common tool for students to launch research projects, right? Because they get to pick one, they can explore it, they can apply to local community. And like I both have done this and seen other people do it where you choose an SDG, a sustainable development goal, you put it into Claude or ChatGPT, and you begin a dialogue around creating a project based on that SDG. So you can actually work with AI to create a project plan for yourself to then go execute on, right? And as a teacher who did a lot of project-based learning when I was teaching, that can often be the most time-consuming, frustrating part of the process for students, which is just coming up with an idea and a plan when what you're really trying to assess is how well they can execute on that plan. And so this idea of how can ChatGPT or generative AI be a thought partner in refining ideas and in structuring plans is a really, I think, powerful use case for it. I was just on a call the other day with a school the American school in Japan, where they have an advanced language class for students who are fluent in both English and Japanese. And the teacher and the students were noticing, they were using AI, generative AI, they were noticing that the tools weren't that great at Japanese translation, at writing in Japanese for lots of different reasons. Smaller data set, a larger number of tokens to learn Japanese, that kind of thing. So what they decided to do as a research project is use the tool Poe. Poe is sort of this like chatbot aggregator that's built by the online site Quora, where you can create customized bots. You can actually give constraints and instructions, and then the bot will perform a certain function. And then you can build the bot off of different large language models. You can build it off of Claude, you can build it off of GPT, you can build it off of Google, right? So their project is, we're going to build Japanese translation bots. We're going to have different bots built on different models, and then we're going to study how well they translate, how well they learn, and how fluent they are, and how aligned that is to the different large language models. And again, I think that's a really interesting way to start to weave AI into core academic content. So yes, there's an element of we have to teach students about AI, but that language class wasn't becoming an AI class, right? Those research projects weren't about AI. It was about how do we weave AI into our academic content so that we can get sort of more interesting looks at how the material might be learned.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm going to if I can find an example of Poe, I'm going to stick that in the episode notes. But what you just described is exactly what we try to do with ed tech. It's not just used in the ed tech class. It's meant to expand and extend what you can do in any class. And so what you're describing, even though this is a very new sort of subset of ed tech or technology in general, it's applying the same kind of rules that we would have applied to ed tech for anything else. Why would we not use this thing for a science class, or why would we not use this thing for a Spanish class?
Yeah, I mean, do you remember the SAMR model? That was like a big
do.
thing in ed tech like 10, 15
big.
years ago, right? It was like substitution, I'm going to get it all wrong. Substitution, augmentation, modification, reinvention, or something like that. I encourage people to look it up. SAMR. Yeah, well, I'll go to Google it after. We'll see. But I actually would encourage folks to go back to that model when they're thinking about AI, because AI can fit in all of those slots, right? And it really does depend on the use case of it. And so I totally agree. I think it's not like we need to be doing all AI all the time, but there's some real potential to be explored here.
Yeah. The example, I want to go back to the one that you gave from the UN. What was it called? The SDG, I think?
Yeah, the Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay. So what you described was using AI to help brainstorm a research project. And I could see someone challenging that and saying, well, wait a second, we want the students to come up with their own ideas. Now, how do you make the argument to them that actually, I mean, you did sort of make the argument, I think, but someone who wants to push that and say, well, wait a second, I want the students to come up with the ideas themselves. Why should I have them use AI when AI is going to come up with the ideas? How do you counter that argument?
I mean, there's lots of different ways to counter that argument. I think first and foremost, it's what are you trying to assess, as we've been talking about. But also second, it's like what is the creative act that you're really interested in, right? Because when I did that SDG sort of simulation with AI, I had to do a lot of creative thinking in my prompting to get the thing to tell me what I wanted it to tell me, right? So there's generative work in sort of learning how to prompt to get high quality information. The other piece for me is, again, students who are embarking on inquiry-based or project-based learning, there's a real tax on cognitive load when they're doing that work because there's no constraints. It's like, here's this list of 17 sustainable development goals. Pick one and then design a project around it.
Right.
That's
and here's all the project criteria and make sure it's going to fit and all. Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a big ask of students. So students are going to need support. Where does that support come from? So the support can come from conferencing with you, the teacher, so which is a very common scenario. It could be Googling around. It could be asking a parent. It could be working with a tutor. It could be talking to your friends. All of those things are probably happening right now when students are getting these open-ended project prompts. Again, I go back to this idea of like, I think we imagine the creative act to be like we go into a vacuum sealed room and like wait for inspiration to descend upon us. Yeah. And like that has never happened for me. I don't know if it's ever happened for you. Like we talk to people, we look on the internet, we try to find models, we look for constraints we look for mental models. Yeah. And I think to me, again, AI exists in that suite of support that is available to students. And I also believe, and we can get into this if you want to, it actually can make support more equitable and accessible for students because for students who don't have a tutor, for students who don't have the other things that I mentioned, who don't have access to those things, AI is there, right? And so I think there is this conversation to be had. Maybe we need to redefine or revise our notion of an assist and the role of automation in the learning process in light of AI, rather than fight this thing that exists, which actually might present some real opportunities for support that weren't there before. Something I've found really helpful in prompting is just saying right up front to have the tool give you multiple options. So if I were doing a research project, I did this the other day with Claude, give me 20 research questions aligned to this particular sustainable development goal that would be relevant to I live on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. So like that would be relevant to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And then I pick the one that resonates, right? So it's not like I'm following a script. I don't want to follow a script necessarily. It's that I am, again, that idea of constraint and lowering cognitive load. Like I am narrowing more quickly than I might have without those guidelines. And again, if you're trying to assess how well a student can get to an idea on their own, that's another thing, right? But if you're just trying to get the student to have a good idea that means something to them, that's a different thing. And I think AI can be really helpful there.
I think that's a really great distinction. And again, going back to assessment, and I just want to throw in one more thing, which right around the same time that you were publishing your series, I was publishing my own on AI. And one of the examples that I used to talk about copyright, and I want to get to copyright in a second, but it was just to sort of debunk the idea of originality, because so much of what we say is original is actually derivative. And Picasso was the example that I used, who is thought of as one of the fathers of Cubism and this incredibly original artist. And if you look at his paintings side by side with African tribal art, there are some really striking similarities. And so something that we think is original really isn't completely original. And it's very difficult to say, I want to assess your pure originality. Going into the room and having ideation strike, it's just not a thing that humans tend to do. So kind of let's wipe that idea right off the map from the start. Yeah. But let's talk about copyright, because the way that all of these systems work is they go out, they learn a vast amount of information. I mean, potentially millions to billions of pieces of information about any given subject. And from that, build an understanding of what that is and how that works. And so then when you come to them and say, create this thing, it's based on what they've learned. And so therefore, there's every potential that the machine is going to use something that it created in what it gives you. And as a result, we're starting to see case law emerge about copyright, particularly with images where artists are saying, DALL-E is copying my work. And I mean, in my post, I used an example where I asked it for a cartoon image of a happy baby in the Tom and Jerry cartoon style. And it gave me something that really could be in a Tom and Jerry cartoon. And if I had created Tom and Jerry, I might not be so happy about that. So how do we work within that idea about copyright?
Yeah, this is where we start getting above my pay grade, but I guess
Professor
I would
Hudson,
say,
please address
yeah,
that.
yeah. Professor Hudson might know. No, there was, and it goes beyond images, right? Like the writer's strike in Hollywood. A big part of this was, sort of the
AI
idea
protections,
that
yeah.
Exactly. And the Atlantic magazine put out a database where you could search to see which copyrighted texts, novels, works of nonfiction were being used to train AI models. And there was a little thing on social media where authors were finding out that their novels or their work was being used to train AI without their consent, right? And they were really sort of spinning out all these scenarios where, Lauren Groff is one of my favorite writers. All of her novels were being trained in AI, and I could ask AI to write me a novel in the style of Lauren Groff if I wanted to, and she gets totally cut out of the process and the revenue and all those things. That's very real, is very concerning, and the government's running a little behind in terms of regulating things like that. I think those are things we just need to be aware of. All the problematic practices involved in AI, the algorithmic biases. Bloomberg did an amazing study, which I encourage people to Google, where they basically use DALL-E to generate images of, show me an image of a CEO, show me an image of a fast food worker, show me an image of an architect. And the racial distinctions were astonishing, right? And so that all goes to show that, first of all, we are biased. AI is being trained on content we create, but it also can exacerbate those biases, right? And so I think these are all, from my level on the field here, those are all things to be very concerned about, to be aware of, and to just talk with students about, and to be mindful of when we use AI. Like, I'm not uploading personal documents into chatbots. I'm not taking, if I were a teacher, I wouldn't take student work without the student's permission and upload it into a chatbot. And if I did do that, I would anonymize it and make sure it was scrubbed of any personal information. Because as much as these companies say that they are kind of building data privacy into their tools, most of us who are using it aren't using the enterprise models, or aren't using the ones that sort of promote the privacy. And so I don't think any of these things are a reason to not use the tools, but I do think there are reasons to just be mindful when you are using them.
Yeah. Definitely complicated. No doubt about that. And we'll see a lot more case law play out about this, I'm sure. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's go back to the really high level on this 50,000-foot view. So you're a school leader. You've graduated from Professor Hudson. You're now Superintendent Hudson. How do you think about policy and strategy and support when you start to think about AI and bringing that into your school or district or system or whatever?
Yeah. Nate Green, who is an academic technology specialist at Sidwell Friends School in DC, he wrote a great article in Slate that sort of relates to this, but he talks about you need a position and a policy, and your position should be first. So if you're a school leader, what is your position on AI? Like, what do you believe about it? What are your values? How does it fit into your mission, into your strategic plan, into your existing acceptable use policy? Like, where do you stand? And then the policy should really come from that. Again, this is not a tool that sort of lives on its own. Like, we've been here before with technological innovation. So articulate a position and then articulate a policy. And then I talk a lot about being flexible. My last Substack was about polarity management, which is this whole idea that polarities are really two opposing ideas that we can't ever resolve. We have to hold them in balance, and it requires ongoing decision making, right? And I think AI really fits in that category of like, well, we can do what we know, and never use AI, or we can explore the unknown and use AI. I actually think it's both, right? We have to rely on what we know and we have to explore the unknown. So what are the decisions that we need to be making that allow us to continue to explore AI while also being responsible in all these things? And so I encourage school leaders to just sort of keep their ear to the ground and be prepared to shift their decision-making over time and just, again, take that learning stance, because things are going to happen with AI that we can't even conceptualize right now. And so it's very hard to be decisive in the face of sort of that much ambiguity and uncertainty. So I think being open and sort of making sure that your policies are not written in stone tablets is really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a great place to end on, that notion of flexibility as we come into this really, really young and unknown future, a thing that's going to be part of our future, and being able to roll with it, because it is definitely going to be shifting.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Eric, listen, this was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your time and energy and interest in this with us. We'll be putting in links to your Substack posts in the episode notes, and also some of the other things you've mentioned, Poe and the study from Bloomberg and the article about the AI being trained on writers' work, and there will be some other things in there for people to click through if they're interested. And of course, we'll have your LinkedIn in there for people to check out what you're doing and hopefully say hi and thank you for sharing this. But for now, I will just say thank you again for sharing this. This was really great, and I really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks, Sean. This was really fun.
Okay, folks, so that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and always keep learning. Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.